The veteran stood silently beside his motorcycle, the sun glinting off the medals pinned to his worn leather jacket, symbols of service, sacrifice, and battles fought for the very freedom others took for granted. But that afternoon, on a quiet roadside, none of that seemed to matter. A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, siren wailing, and a man who once defended his country found himself treated like a criminal. The officer's voice was sharp, dripping with authority abused, his words laced with contempt rather than justice. To everyone watching, it was clear this wasn't about the law. It was about power. The veteran complied, his hand steady, his tone calm, even as humiliation wrapped around him like chains. Years of discipline taught him not to react, but inside, something broke. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, yet the sting of being disrespected by the very people he once fought to protect cut deeper than any wound from the battlefield. The officer sneered, mocking the veteran's age, his scars, his patch-covered jacket, a display of arrogance against a man who had earned every mark of honor on his chest. What the officer didn't realize was that his cruelty had an audience. Across town, whispers began to spread. People who knew the veteran, who had seen his quiet kindness and strength, were not going to let this injustice fade into silence. Among them were riders, men and women bound by loyalty, courage, and an unbreakable code of respect. They called themselves brothers and sisters of the road, and when they heard what had happened, they decided to remind the world that honor was not something to be mocked. By the next sunrise, the sound of dozens of motorcycles thundered through the streets like a storm approaching justice. The officer had no idea that the man he humiliated was not alone, that his uniform might have given him power, but not immunity. What was coming was not vengeance, but balance. It was a lesson written in the language of loyalty, and it would be one he would never forget. Because when a man disrespects a soldier who once fought for freedom, he doesn't just insult a person. He ignites a fire in those who still believe in what's right. And on that day, the road would roar with the sound of justice carried not in badges or laws, but in the hearts of those who still knew the meaning of brotherhood. The next morning, the small town was buzzing with whispers. Everyone had seen the video. Someone from across the street had filmed it. The image of a proud war veteran being shoved, mocked, and treated like a criminal by a man wearing a badge spread faster than the officer could imagine. On social media, comments poured in, angry, heartbroken, and disgusted. The man who had once defended strangers in a foreign land was now being humiliated in his own country. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The veteran, however, remained silent. He didn't seek attention, didn't call for revenge. He went back to his modest life, fixing old bikes in his garage and keeping to himself. But the pain lingered, not from the physical shove or the harsh words, but from the realization that the respect he once fought for seemed to have vanished. He didn't know that miles away, the sound of engines was already revving. His brothers, the riders who had shared the road, who lived by a code of loyalty and justice, had seen everything, and they weren't going to stay silent. In the world of bikers, brotherhood isn't just a word, it's a vow. It means standing up for one another when no one else will. And when they saw the veteran disrespected, they felt it personally. That man was one of them. He had worn the same leather, ridden the same roads, and carried the same code in his heart. So they gathered, not out of rage, but out of principle. They weren't there to cause chaos. They were there to remind everyone, especially one arrogant cop, that respect is not optional. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of engines echoed through the valley. Dozens of riders, headlights glowing like torches, began to roll toward town. Their presence was impossible to ignore. Thunder on asphalt, a moving storm of justice. They didn't need weapons. Their unity was enough. And as they rode, word spread like wildfire. They're coming for the officer who disrespected the veteran. Meanwhile, the officer sat in his patrol car, oblivious to the storm brewing. He thought the video would fade away like every other controversy, swallowed by the next scandal. But this was different. This was personal. What he had done wasn't just seen. It had awakened something in people who still believed that honor mattered more than authority. And soon, he would learn that the road remembers everything. The next afternoon, the roar of engines grew louder as the riders entered the town. The officer's arrogance began to waver the moment he saw them. line after line of motorcycles stretching down the street, chrome gleaming in the sunlight. They didn't move fast. They didn't need to. Their slow approach carried more weight than any confrontation could. People stepped out of stores and restaurants, phones in hand, capturing what looked less like rebellion and more like justice in motion. At the front of the convoy rode the veterans' closest brothers, men with faces hardened by time, but eyes filled with conviction. They stopped in front of the police station, engines still running, a symphony of power and defiance. The officer stepped outside, trying to act unfazed, but his voice faltered when he demanded to know what they wanted. No one answered immediately. The leader dismounted, walked forward, and stood face to face with him. The air between them was electric, two men on opposite sides of what was right. "You humiliated a man who defended this country," the leader said, his tone calm but unyielding. "You mocked a hero because you thought your badge made you untouchable. But out here, respect isn't given by rank, it's earned." The crowd surrounding them fell silent, the only sound being the low rumble of idling motorcycles. The officer tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the sound of engines revving in unison, a roar that carried more meaning than 1,000 protests. The officer's composure cracked. For the first time, he realized that his uniform didn't make him powerful, it made him accountable. The veteran hadn't asked for this confrontation. He hadn't called anyone. But his brother showed up because injustice, once seen, demanded a response. And this response was one of unity, not violence. No fists were raised, no threats made. The message was simple: you can't abuse power without consequence. When the riders finally turned off their engines, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The officer looked around at the sea of leather jackets and determined faces and saw something he didn't expect: discipline, strength, honor, qualities he had mocked but never understood. And for the first time, he felt the weight of shame, not because he had been confronted, but because he realized how small he truly was next to men who didn't need badges to command respect. The veteran hadn't planned to go to the station that day. He didn't even know his brothers were riding for him until the echo of engines reached his street. At first, he thought it was a parade, but then he saw them: the flags, the patches, the unmistakable line of riders filling the horizon. His heart tightened. These were his people, the ones who didn't need to be asked for help, because loyalty was their instinct. When he saw where they were heading, he realized this wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoring what had been taken from him: his dignity. He rode out to meet them, his old bike sputtering to life, its sound humble among the roaring machines. When the convoy noticed him, the riders split their formation, allowing him to take his place at the front. No words were spoken, none were needed. Together, they rode through the streets as the town watched, windows filled with faces and hearts pounding in silent respect. It was the kind of unity people only read about, the kind that humbles arrogance and elevates courage. At the station, the officer's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief as the veteran dismounted and walked toward him. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. The old man's boots scuffed against the concrete as he approached, his gaze unwavering. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply looked the officer in the eyes and said, "You wear that badge to protect, not to humiliate. You forgot that." But I didn't. The quiet that followed was deafening, and even the riders, hardened by years on the road, felt a lump rise in their throats. The officer opened his mouth to defend himself, but his voice cracked before the words could leave. The weight of the veteran's calm truth was heavier than any punishment. The moment wasn't about revenge, it was about revelation. In that silence, the officer saw what the badge was meant to represent and how far he'd strayed from it. He realized that his abuse of power had not only disgraced himself, but had disrespected everyone who had ever truly served. Then, the veteran turned to his brothers and gave a slight nod. That was the signal. Engines ignited once more, a rolling thunder that spoke of unity, of defiance against injustice, of respect earned the hard way. They didn't stay to gloat. They didn't need to. Their message had been delivered, not in violence, but in honor. And as they rode away, the town erupted in applause, because deep down, everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the town. The video of the confrontation went viral, reaching millions of people across the country. It wasn't the humiliation of the officer that caught people's attention. It was the grace of the veteran and the silent strength of the riders. They didn't come to destroy. They came to remind. Remind the world that respect must flow both ways, that those who protect deserve to be protected, too. The internet, usually divided by anger, found itself united by admiration. The officer was suspended pending investigation, but the punishment that truly mattered was the one he carried inside. Every time he saw a veteran's cap, every time he passed a motorcycle on the street, he was reminded of that day. The day he learned that power without humility is emptiness. And for the first time in his career, he started listening more than talking, serving more than commanding. The lesson had burned deeply, and perhaps that was the real justice. The veteran, meanwhile, went back to his quiet life, but things were different now. Strangers stopped by his shop to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him that his calm courage had restored their faith in something greater. Children asked about his medals, and he told them not about war, but about honor. His story became more than an incident. It became a parable, a lesson that strength isn't in how loud you shout, but in how steadfast you stand when wronged. The riders didn't speak much of that day either. For them, it wasn't about glory. It was about doing what was right and disappearing back into the road where they belonged. Their code didn't seek recognition. It sought righteousness. They had shown the world that brotherhood wasn't about rebellion. It was about justice, loyalty, and love for those who had carried the burden of protecting others. And as they rode out under the setting sun, the sound of their engines faded into the distance, but the echo of that day remained. The veteran stood at the edge of his street, watching the horizon. He knew the road would keep calling them, just as honor always calls those who remember what it truly means to serve. The world had seen their strength, but only they understood its cost and its purpose. Weeks passed, yet the echo of that day refused to fade. Across the country, veterans, bikers, and ordinary citizens found something powerful in the story, a reminder that courage still existed in quiet forms. News outlets tried to sensationalize it, calling the riders a motorcycle militia, but those who had watched the full video knew better. They saw respect, not rebellion. They saw discipline, not destruction. The story wasn't about defiance. It was about dignity reclaimed. The veteran began receiving letters from people he had never met. Soldiers who felt forgotten, young men struggling to find purpose, women thanking him for proving that honor still had a place in the modern world. Each word touched him deeply. He had never wanted recognition, but perhaps, he thought, this was the reason it all happened, to remind people that decency still mattered. The world had grown loud with arrogance, but sometimes the quiet strength of one act could silence the noise. Meanwhile, the officer, once so proud of his authority, walked through his days like a shadow of himself. The station had become a cold place for him. His colleagues spoke little, their eyes heavy with disappointment. He had been the example of what not to become, a man who forgot that his duty was service, not control. But something in him shifted. He started visiting veteran support centers, offering help where he could. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was awakening. Either way, the man who once disrespected a veteran now spent his days trying to honor them. One afternoon, the officer stood outside the old biker's repair shop. He hesitated before stepping inside. The veteran looked up from his workbench, surprised but calm. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly, the officer said, "I came to apologize." His voice cracked under the weight of his own shame. "You didn't deserve what I did." The veteran studied him, the silence stretching between them like a test of sincerity. Finally, he nodded and said, "Then don't waste your apology. Use it to do better." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. And for the first time in months, he smiled, not out of pride, but out of relief. Outside, a few motorcycles rumbled past, their engines low and steady. The sound made him glance toward the road, and he understood something profound. Respect isn't demanded by position. It's earned through action. The apology, though simple, carried ripple effects that neither man expected. Word spread quietly through the biker community, and soon, The same officer who once stood as a symbol of arrogance began to be seen differently. Not as forgiven, but as changed. He started attending biker charity events, supporting veterans' hospitals, and helping raise funds for wounded soldiers. At first, people were skeptical, but over time, his consistency spoke louder than his past. He had taken his humiliation and turned it into purpose. The veteran, though he never sought attention, became a quiet figure of strength in his town. People came to his shop not just for repairs, but for wisdom. He never lectured, never boasted. Instead, he listened, really listened. He understood pain in others because he had carried it himself. And those who entered his garage often left lighter, reminded that resilience wasn't about being unbroken, but about standing tall despite the cracks. The bikers, his brothers, continued their rides across states, helping other veterans who felt abandoned or unseen. They rode in memory of the fallen and in honor of the living. Every time they passed a police cruiser, the tension that once existed seemed to dissolve a little more. Mutual respect began to take root where resentment once thrived. What had started as a moment of injustice had evolved into a bridge between authority and community, between silence and understanding. Months later, at a charity ride organized to support homeless veterans, the officer and the old soldier met again. This time, they stood side by side, handing out food and shaking hands. Cameras were everywhere, but neither cared for recognition. They weren't posing for redemption or fame. They were there because something greater had taken shape between them, a shared truth that power without compassion means nothing, and that forgiveness, when real, can rebuild even the deepest fractures. As the engines roared once more, the veteran watched the convoy disappear into the horizon. The sunlight glinted off chrome and leather, off helmets that reflected both sky and road. He smiled faintly, thinking of how far they had all come, from humiliation to healing, from division to unity. The world often forgot that stories like this were possible, but he didn't. He had lived it. He had seen how respect, once lost, could be restored when men chose humility over pride. Time moved forward, yet the bond between the veteran, the officer, and the riders only grew stronger. What began as confrontation had transformed into a movement, one grounded in humility, honor, and redemption. The veteran became a silent mentor to many, teaching through his example rather than his words. The officer visited often, not out of guilt anymore, but out of gratitude. Every conversation between them carried an unspoken understanding that respect could be rebuilt only through action repeated over time. The community began to follow their lead. The same streets that once whispered about injustice now echoed with stories of unity. Police officers joined local charity rides, saluting veterans as they passed. Children waved flags from sidewalks, learning that real strength came not from uniforms or titles, but from integrity. The tension that had once divided the town began to dissolve. The noise of judgment and anger was replaced by the sound of roaring engines and shared purpose. The veteran's shop became a symbol, its old wooden sign now recognized far beyond the town limits. People traveled from distant cities just to shake his hand, to thank him for being a reminder that dignity can change the world. But he always brushed it off, saying softly, "I didn't change anything. I just stood my ground." And in that humble answer lay the truth. One act of integrity can ignite thousands more. Meanwhile, the bikers continued to expand their mission. What started as a brotherhood turned into an organized network that rescued veterans struggling with poverty, addiction, and loneliness. They called it the Honor Ride. Every weekend, convoys roared through towns, bringing not just food or aid, but visibility. They wanted the forgotten to be seen again. They wanted the nation to remember its heroes not with pity, but with pride. And each time they rode, somewhere in that convoy was the officer, helmet on, hand steady, carrying no badge, no authority, just the same conviction as everyone else. To the veteran, it was the truest form of justice, when those who had fallen short learned to rise again. Watching him ride among the men he once wronged, the old soldier realized something profound. Redemption, when genuine, was louder than any apology. The years passed, and seasons changed, but the story of that day, the day the bikers stood up for the veteran, became legend. Not because of anger or revenge, but because of transformation. Schools taught it as an example of courage and humility. It was shared in news reports, documentaries, and social media posts titled, "The Day the Road Fought for Respect." What had started as an act of defiance became a national reminder that justice does not always roar with fury. It often rides quietly, steady and strong. The veteran grew older, but his spirit never dimmed. On quiet evenings, he would sit outside his shop, the wind carrying faint echoes of engines from the highway. Each sound brought back memories, not of the confrontation, but of unity. He had seen something the world rarely witnessed, people coming together not for power, but for principle. It reminded him that even after war, there were still battles worth fighting, the battles for kindness, respect, and humanity. One summer, the riders returned once again. Hundreds of motorcycles filled the main street, the air trembling with thunder. But this time, they weren't there to defend. They were there to celebrate. The veteran's name had become synonymous with honor, and the gathering was held to dedicate a memorial to all who had served, protected, and sacrificed for something greater than themselves. When the officer arrived, no one looked at him with judgment anymore. He stood among friends, his eyes shining with gratitude and redemption. The veteran took the stage to speak, his voice steady but aged. "Respect," he said, "isn't given by power. It's earned through how we treat those who can't fight back." That day wasn't about me. It was about what we all forgot for a moment. That honor doesn't belong to one man, one badge, or one group. It belongs to anyone brave enough to do what's right. His words carried through the crowd like the echo of engines, vibrating in the hearts of everyone listening. As the riders mounted their bikes again and the engines roared in unison, the sound became more than just noise. It was a living heartbeat of brotherhood, a reminder that when injustice rises, so too will those who still believe in what's right. The veterans smiled as they disappeared into the horizon, knowing the world would remember. Not the humiliation, not the anger, but the moment when humanity chose to stand together. Years later, the story still echoed across highways and small-town diners, told by old riders with weathered hands and by young recruits eager to carry the legacy forward. They spoke not of vengeance or rebellion, but of a moment when courage took the shape of unity. The veteran's name became a symbol, a reminder that honor never truly dies. It only waits for the right people to revive it. The officer's redemption had become part of that legend too, a proof that even those who stumble can rise again if they choose humility over pride. The veteran's health began to fade, but his heart remained strong. Each morning, he would sit by the window of his shop, coffee in hand, listening for the distant hum of motorcycles. And every so often, it came, the faint thunder of engines rolling past his street, just to let him know they still remembered. Those moments were his peace. He had fought in wars, endured injustice, and witnessed transformation. Now, hearing the sound of loyalty still alive in the world was all the reward he needed. One evening, a young boy entered the shop. He couldn't have been older than 10, clutching a worn American flag in his hands. "My grandpa said you're a hero," the boy said softly. The veteran smiled, shaking his head. "No, son. Heroes are the ones who don't stay silent when they see wrong. Remember that." The boy nodded, his eyes wide, understanding more than words could express. That night, as the boy left, the old soldier felt something lift inside him, a quiet assurance that the next generation would carry the flame. The officer visited often, no longer in uniform, but as a friend. They would sit in the fading light, two men who had once stood on opposite sides of morality, now united by truth. "You know," the officer once said, "I think that day changed me more than it ever changed you." The veteran chuckled, his eyes glinting. That's how life works. Sometimes we're the ones who fall, and sometimes we're the ones who help others stand. What matters is that we all keep standing. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles filled the dusk again. The veteran turned his head toward the sound, his lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't just noise. It was a hymn of freedom, of brotherhood, of justice reborn. And as the roar faded into the distance, he whispered to himself, "That's the sound of men who still remember." When the veteran passed away, the news spread across the country like wildfire. Riders from every state converged on his town, their engines thundering across the highways in what became the largest memorial ride anyone had ever seen. Thousands came, veterans, officers, families, and strangers, each drawn not by fame or obligation, but by gratitude. The man who once stood alone now rode again, carried home by the very brotherhood that had risen for him years ago. The procession stretched for miles, chrome gleaming in the sunlight, flags waving in the wind. As they reached the cemetery, the engines fell silent, leaving only the soft cry of the wind and the rustle of flags. The officer, standing beside the casket, removed his cap and placed his hand over his heart. In that silence, every man and woman there felt the same truth. The world had lost a soldier, but it had gained a legacy. The officer spoke quietly before the crowd. He taught me that respect isn't about rank or badge. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching. I failed him once, but since that day, I've tried to live by the code he showed me. Serve with humility, protect with honor, and never forget those who came before. His voice trembled, and as he stepped back, a single engine revved in the distance, soon joined by hundreds more, a chorus of farewell that shook the ground beneath their feet. When the final echo faded, a boy, the same one who once visited the veteran's shop, stepped forward and placed that old, folded flag on the grave. He said, "Heroes are the ones who don't stay silent," the boy whispered. The crowd bowed their heads. The old soldier's message had lived on, passing from calloused hands to innocent ones, from one generation to the next. And when the riders finally left, the horizon shimmered with heat and light, their engines fading into eternity. But the world still felt their presence, because somewhere out there, on every long stretch of road, the spirit of the veteran rode with them, a guardian of honor, a reminder that real justice doesn't come from fear, but from courage. And as long as engines roar and people remember, that day, the day bikers stood for a soldier, will never die. The story of the veteran and the officer is not just about justice. It's about transformation. It's a reminder that even in a world hardened by pride and power, redemption is still possible. One act of arrogance exposed the fragility of authority, but one act of brotherhood revealed the strength of humanity. Those riders didn't come to destroy. They came to remind us that respect is sacred, and that when we forget it, there are still those willing to restore it, not through violence, but through unity. This story teaches that real strength doesn't wear a badge, a uniform, or a medal. It lives in the heart of anyone who stands for what's right when it's easier to stay silent. The veteran's calm defiance, the rider's loyalty, and even the officer's humility in the end form a lesson deeper than any punishment could deliver. Power may demand obedience, but respect must be earned, and once it's lost, only truth and integrity can bring it back. The thunder of those engines wasn't just a call for justice. It was a voice for every person who's ever been silenced, disrespected, or forgotten. It spoke of brotherhood, of honor, and of the belief that no one who serves others should ever stand alone. The world will always have those who abuse their power, but it will also have those who rise, together, to confront them. That balance, the courage to protect what's right, is what keeps humanity alive. So when you think of that day, don't just remember the confrontation, remember what followed. Remember how compassion turned a mistake into a movement, how forgiveness became strength, and how a community found its heartbeat again in the roar of engines. That's what honor truly means. Not perfection, but the courage to rise when everything has fallen apart. If this story moved you, let it stay with you. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice might inspire someone who's lost their faith in decency. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that reminds us what humanity still looks like. And leave a like if you believe that honor, compassion, and brotherhood still matter in this world. Sometimes, one story is all it takes to make people remember what's worth standing for.